It is often debated whether volume or intensity is the key driver of hypertrophy. We don't fully understand which is more important, but we can look at both variables to determine their effects on muscle growth. This is exactly what we will be doing in this video to try and better understand the roles of volume and intensity on hypertrophy. First, we need to define each variable. Let's now explore exactly what volume and intensity are in relation to hypertrophy training. Volume is much easier to define than intensity. For hypertrophy training, volume is best defined using the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. This is used instead of volume load, meaning sets times reps times load, since hypertrophy can be achieved across a large spectrum of different rep ranges and loads. So assuming we are training fairly close to failure, each set will be similarly hypertrophic. So volume load isn't really a good metric to use for hypertrophy training, since we can achieve equal hypertrophy outcomes even if volume load is significantly different. This idea was also confirmed by this research review, which concluded that volume can be effectively quantified using the number of sets performed per muscle group per week when training anywhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range and training close to failure. Intensity, on the other hand, is more difficult to define for hypertrophy training. For strength training, intensity refers to the load lifted on the bar, but for hypertrophy training, it is not so straightforward. As we know, hypertrophy can be achieved anywhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range, provided that sets are taken close to failure. So load lifted isn't really relevant as a metric for intensity for hypertrophy training. Rather, a more appropriate metric would be proximity to failure. In other words, how close a set is taken to failure. A closer proximity to failure would be a higher intensity, and a further proximity from failure would be a lower intensity. This can be quantified using the reps in reserve scale. 0 reps in reserve means that no more full reps could have been performed in that set. 1 rep in reserve means 1 more rep could have been performed in that set. 2 reps in reserve means that 2 more reps could have been performed, and so on. Now that we understand what volume and intensity are in relation to hypertrophy training, let's explore why this is a somewhat debated topic. Essentially, there is somewhat of a trade-off between volume and intensity. On paper, it seems that we can have both high volume and high intensity together. However, in practice, increasing one will generally sacrifice the other to some extent. When we increase volume, our training sessions become longer and more mentally fatiguing. Naturally, this usually causes us to subconsciously reduce intensity slightly. Because we know that we have a high volume training session up ahead, we may not push each set as close to failure. Even if we perceive that we are training with the same intensity, we likely aren't performing as many reps each set compared with a lower volume training session. This is especially exacerbated towards the end of a high volume workout where we are both physically and mentally more fatigued. And this is also exacerbated with higher rep ranges where proximity to failure is more difficult to judge. Furthermore, our session-to-session recovery ability is also affected by training volume. When more volume is performed, it induces more fatigue, and performance of subsequent training sessions are inhibited slightly. When volume is lower, less fatigue accumulates, and performance will likely be greater in the following training sessions. This means we may be able to perform more reps of a lift or lift more weight each session using a lower volume approach. However, this is more of an acute fatigue marker, so we don't really know if this will influence long-term muscle growth. So unfortunately, there is usually somewhat of an inverse relationship between volume and intensity. As volume increases, intensity generally decreases, and as volume decreases, intensity generally increases. So to understand which variable is more important, let's look at how each influences hypertrophy. First, we will explore the effect of volume on hypertrophy outcomes. It is quite clear that more volume tends to result in greater muscle growth, even up to very extreme levels. For example, this study explored the effects of the same resistance training program with different numbers of sets. It was found that training with more sets, up to 32 sets per muscle group per week, resulted in greater muscle growth than training with fewer sets, for all muscles measured. However, if we look at the exact training protocol used in this study, it may put these results into a better perspective. This study had trainees perform the following exercises with all exercises taken to failure. Furthermore, trainees were only allowed 60 seconds rest between sets. So just looking at this on paper, it seems pretty clear that training quality probably wasn't all that great. For isolation exercises like bicep curls, reverse flies, or tricep extensions, multiple sets with 60 seconds rest is fairly reasonable. But for other exercises, it is probably not. For example, performing 8 sets of back squats, bench press, or lat pull downs to failure with 60 seconds rest, it is almost impossible to maintain good performance, effective technique, and a high training quality. So the research tends to show that more volume is better for muscle growth. However, maybe we could have gotten equally as effective results with lower volumes and high training quality. If a lifter was to perform one of the lower volume training protocols with longer rest and a focus on quality, then maybe they would have gotten equal results to the high volume group while performing less volume with greater intensity. This is potentially true when we look at the influence of intensity on hypertrophy gains. It generally seems that training closer to failure is slightly more hypertrophic compared with training further from failure. This is probably because training closer to failure will progressively recruit more and more motor units and train more muscle fibers. This is especially true when training with lighter loads and higher rep ranges, since lighter loads won't recruit as many motor units from the start of the set compared with heavier loads. While this makes sense in theory, how does this play out in practice? This meta-analysis explored the research comparing training to failure versus not training to failure on muscle growth. It was found that although it wasn't considered statistically significant, training to failure tended to result in superior hypertrophy outcomes compared with not training to failure. Furthermore, this study explored the effects of training to failure versus leaving a few reps in reserve when training with heavier versus lighter loads. It was found that when training with 80% 1RM, training to failure was only slightly superior than training with a few reps in reserve. However, with 30% 1RM, training to failure had a much more significant impact on muscle growth, and leaving a few reps in reserve resulted in significantly less muscle growth. So it is quite clear that training to failure, or at least very close to failure, will likely result in superior muscle growth per set, especially with lighter loads. This can make our training more efficient by providing a greater stimulus per set. So like volume, intensity does certainly seem to have a significant impact on muscle growth too. So which is more important, volume or intensity? Well, from what we have explored, I don't think this is the right question to be asking. What we have found is that both variables can have a positive effect on muscle growth. So rather than one being more important than the other, they may just play different roles in the hypertrophy training process. It seems that intensity is a more qualitative consideration, while volume is purely quantitative. From what we understand, more volume is better, but maybe not at the expense of intensity. To understand this, let's go through an example. If we perform 3 sets of high quality training, let's say each set provides an arbitrary 10 units of muscle growth. So our total muscle growth would be 30 units. In another training session, we may perform more volume, but sacrifice quality slightly. So let's say we perform 5 sets, and each set provides 6 units of muscle growth. This would also result in 30 total units, so muscle growth outcomes would be the same between sessions. Ideally, we would want to perform more volume with the same high quality, which would result in the greatest overall muscle growth. For example, if we were to perform 5 sets with high quality, let's say 10 units, then we would accumulate 50 units of muscle growth, since both quality and quantity were high. So as we can see, neither variable is more important than the other, rather they just play slightly different roles. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. Both volume and intensity are important considerations for hypertrophy training. Volume provides the total amount of training performed, while intensity can be thought of as efficiency, or the effectiveness of each set. In my opinion, we should always focus on improving quality first before adding volume. Once training quality is very high, then we can consider adding more volume. Adding more low quality volume will likely result in greater muscle growth, but this makes the training process less efficient. Rather, we may be better off improving our training quality and reducing our volume to get a better stimulus with fewer sets. So really, the best combination would be high volume and high intensity, as this would result in high efficiency and a high total workload. However, this is very difficult to achieve in practice because, like we mentioned, there is an inherent trade-off between volume and intensity. However, with experience, trainees can become better and better at maintaining intensity, even with higher volumes, allowing them to train with both high quality and high quantity. Exactly where this balance lies will be different for each lifter and will likely differ across a training career. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.